Now on Money Talk 1010 AM, it's the Morgan Streetman Show. Morgan and Roxanne Wilder are discussing everything from world, national, and local issues to information from the unknown. And since Morgan's an attorney, there'll probably be a little something from the law. Now, here are Morgan Streetman and Roxanne Wilder.
Well, hello there. Both Morgan and I sound a little bit like we're being affected by the pollen at this time of year, but that's okay.
I'll tell you
husky pollen voices.
I feel like my sinuses are completely waterlogged
We
this
can't
morning.
hear each other. We sound like we're underwater to one another.
Yeah,
And hopefully we
yeah.
don't sound... Do we sound like that to everybody else, Pat?
I
we
can
underwater?
sense us just a tad. No, we're not underwater, but I can sense that there is a little
The
bit
two
of
of
difference in the voice, sure. Mm-hmm. I'm so lucky that a lot of this does not affect me.
You are a lucky man.
And you're
had
lucky
a
George?
if it is contagious, which it's not. It's just pollen. But you're
Yeah.
on the other side of the glass.
Yeah.
Right?
What are you talking about, contagious?
Every year, this time of year, this same thing happens. I mean, it is a struggle to get through the
Me too.
spring in Florida.
Me too.
For me,
Yep,
with that, and
I'm
I've
the
got
same way.
major allergies. But I
This
tell
year
you,
seems the worst.
yeah, this year's
A
pretty
long time.
bad. This year's bad. It was a couple of years ago. It was severe too. I remember not even being able to walk outside without getting in hay fever, sneezing fits. But yeah, this year's worse than last year, I think, and I don't know why that would be. But, well, speaking of, bad things going on right now, I mean, we've just got a whole slew of bad things going on, and I think it's only fair to start with what's going on over there in Sri Lanka,
Yeah,
or
so
what happened
sad.
yesterday.
Tragic.
I mean, almost 300 people killed at this point, and that number is probably going to keep going up as people who are injured may, pass away. There were almost 500 people separately injured who didn't die. So that's a terrorist attack, taking out about 1,000 people in total. I mean, that's huge. That's huge. And it was 8 different bombs, several different locations. They bombed a number of churches. And can you even imagine right in the middle? I mean, this is the highest holy day of the Christian calendar, is Easter or Resurrection Day, whatever you want to call it, but the day that commemorates the day that Jesus rose from the dead. That is sort of the pinnacle of Christianity. And so I'm sure this date was very carefully chosen by whoever wanted to do these attacks to make the maximum negative effect on the Christians. I mean, this was clearly targeting the Christians in Sri Lanka, of whom there are not all that many. It's actually very much the minority. Sri Lanka is majority Hindu. And I don't know if you're familiar with the fact. I mean, Sri Lanka's been in a civil war. I mean, it's been over for about 10 years.
That was about 2009 it ended, right?
Yeah, and it had started back in the early 80s.
Right.
I mean, it's like a 30-year war, almost 30 years that they were at this, dealing with this civil war. And that was between some ethnic peoples who called themselves the Tamil people. I don't know if you've heard of that, Tamil Tigers. You heard of the Tamil Tigers? They're kind of famous. And this is all going on right in Sri Lanka proper, which is a pretty small island off the tip of India. And, but it's got a decent-sized population of about 20-something million people. And the city yesterday where these bombings occurred was Colombo, which obviously was named after Christopher Columbus, but Colombo, and that has about a population of about 6 million people. So for a relatively small island, it's actually got a pretty sizable population. I mean, the population density is significantly higher than what it is here in Tampa Bay.
Sure.
Put it that way. But this civil war has been going on this small island for 30 years, and they've been blowing each other up. They've had terrorist attacks. I mean, the Tamil Tigers are actually known as the terrorist group, and they're not purely Islamic. So it's not this isn't necessarily, the Tamil Tigers weren't necessarily Islamic terror, but they were known as the group that first started using women suicide bombers. The first ones ever to use women. So they've been blowing each other up in Sri Lanka for a long time now, and that had finally calmed down. And until what we're now seeing come out, which I see this morning and some in the evening last night, some of the allocation of responsibility for this particular attack, then it does look like it's being allocated to Islamic terrorists, a group that's sort of affiliated with the ISIS movement worldwide, the ISIS caliphate. And so, originally when I heard about this, I was talking to some friends yesterday and family, and, I was cautioning everybody, we need to be careful not to quickly blame this on Muslim terrorists, because of the history in Sri Lanka, of there being these kind of bombings and things. And this could have been actually Hindu terrorists. But now we see it does look like, it certainly had all the hallmarks of Islamic terrorism, multiple coordinated attacks at the same time. They say that's one of the hallmarks of the Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists and what they try to try to do and try to accomplish. So it does seem like based on what I'm reading now, that, responsibility has been allocated. I'm not sure if it's been accepted by the group, but it's been pretty clearly allocated to the group. So I don't know that they've claimed responsibility yet, and that may be coming. But I think the authorities are saying this was Islamic terror, which is, frankly, guys, when we saw it,
said that.
Yes. Yeah, when we saw it, that's what first came to mind, right?
Yes, and I was just reading a story about. Are you familiar with Anders Holch Povelsen? He's a Danish billionaire.
No,
he's the wealthiest man in
Denmark.
Well, yes, thank you. In Danish, no, in Denmark, yes. It's Monday. In any case, just awful. He was there on vacation with his wife and his family, and 3 of his children were those who were killed.
Oh, it's you can't even. It's hard for me to even imagine. This is a celebration day. It's a happy day. I'm sure nobody was expecting this, particularly the people at the churches. And one of these churches the bomb was so severe that it blew the roof off the church.
What about sitting in a church now and think people expect it probably now?
Well,
if not, you're going to have guards at the front door.
Yeah,
metal detectors at one point.
Is that what we're coming to?
It's just there's no other answer because you can't stop this stuff.
You can't stop it, and that's the key, Pat. Because if they didn't get you at the church, they'll go get you where you're having Sunday brunch at the hotel or something.
Well, no, in international hotels. Mm-hmm. The bigger the better they go after.
Well, that's what I mean. People that were out having breakfast that morning were celebrating the Easter holiday. That's why they were out. That's why they were out at the hotels. That's why they were all dressed up and everything else. Right. And these people came and stood in line. In the one of the guys apparently stood in the buffet line till he got up to the front and blew himself up. It's just hard to even fathom the kind of shock that you'd experience if you were involved if you were around when something like that happened.
And how do you stop something like that? You don't.
That's right.
Just standing there.
It's impossible. Yeah. It's at some point, it's
especially
like they used to say about
do the suicide bombing.
Yeah, right. And it's kind of like what they would say about people wanting to assassinate the president or something. They say, if you're willing to trade your life for the president, then you might be able to get him. That's the point. At some point, we can have a lot of, procedures and processes in place to try to prevent something, but it's impossible. It's just not possible. If somebody is willing to trade their life in a suicide bombing, some of them are going to get through. And at least 8 of them got through yesterday. And apparently there were other bombs that didn't go off, that were also slated for detonation. Some of those apparently have been blown up this morning by the authorities. So, and yet there's the guy. I saw him all over the... he looks guilty. I hate to say it, but, he just, I'm not sure if we even need to have a trial. I'm just looking at that guy and I'm going, he's guilty. Right. He's definitely guilty.
The one who's... Is he taking responsibility for it? It looks like he may be.
I don't know. I don't know if he's come out and done that yet.
Maybe not. Okay, it's just a question. Is this the mastermind?
Is that the mastermind? Because I know that he, and there he is giving the ISIS salute, which is the one finger up symbol, and that's the I for ISIS, or ISIL, whatever you want to call it, Islamic State. So, these folks are out there. We know that. It's interesting because here we are talking about the Sri Lanka, and just to close out on that, because we could talk about that the whole show today, I just want to say personally, I think the 3 of us, our thoughts and prayers are with those people in Sri Lanka. I was very disturbed by that. And I don't think you've seen anything near the media exposure of some of that and the tone that you heard when we had the mosque attack in New Zealand, which killed fewer people, frankly, and was less spectacular. But the tone is different. If you even watch what, some of the chattering class is saying, like former President Obama, and they don't want to mention that the attack was directed to Christians on their highest holy day. They don't want to mention that. So they say this is an attack on all of humanity and all religions or that sort of thing. But, when they were talking about the mosque shooting in New Zealand, they were very explicit that this was an attack on the Muslim population and that we, the chattering class, we, the representatives, whatever they are, we stand with the Muslims. And they were very clear about that. So I just think it's interesting when you look at these two things, they won't say that about the Christians. They won't say it. And, and I'm getting tired of Christians getting blamed for things like terrorism and stuff like that because, they always bring up the Crusades and stuff, and that we don't have time to cover all this in this show. But, the Crusades weren't, this horrible reign of Christian terrorism in the Middle East. Remember what the Crusades were all about was protecting pilgrims from Europe who were traveling to the Middle East, who were being attacked, abused, robbed, raped, and killed on the way. So that's what the Crusades were about, was protecting pilgrims who wanted to go down there. So anyway, we got so much more to cover in today's show. We haven't hit our quick look back segment yet. We haven't talked about our local interest. I also wanted to kind of flow into some of the Notre Dame stuff because, that happened shortly after we were on the air last week. I think it was actually technically going on right when we were on the air, but it hadn't made the news yet. So we didn't get to talk about that at all last week. But, that was something pretty horrifying that occurred just last week. We've had Julian Assange picked up for, international extradition to the U.S. We talked a little bit about that, but there's plenty more to talk about. We had the Mueller report come out finally last week. The Mueller report was released. And, of course, we could do a whole show on just that. And then, of course, we've got to finish up with our Out There today, going back underwater civilizations. We'll be right back. And welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. Folks, during the break, we were just having an interesting discussion about the pronunciation, the proper pronunciation of Notre Dame.
Yes. So basically, when this story broke last week, I'm a very visual person.
Yeah.
So when I'm reading a story or I'm going to say Notre Dame because that's how I see it because I covered football for so long and we live here.
Right.
But then I heard everybody start to say Notre Dame. So that's how I've been saying it. But I think you're okay either way.
All right. Well, I'm like South Bend, Indiana, Rudy style. That's what I remember because I spent a little time growing up in Indianapolis, and so I was a big, as we called it, Notre Dame fan. I had the sweatshirts and everything else. In fact, when I was back playing football, that's where I wanted to go play football. Of course, we're going back many decades now. But so, yes, I just sort of, just roll into Notre Dame because that, to me, is like you say, when you read it, that's what it says. But you're exactly right. The correct pronunciation should be Notre Dame. And that kind of brings us to what I was going to do as our quick look back segment. And that is a little bit of correction. Because one of the things that we do here, we have a conversation on this show. We want you to be involved in the conversation, by the way. And if you want to get on the horn with us, it's 888-404-1010. But we try to have an honest conversation among ourselves as well as with our audience. And we don't script this show. We are not reading from teleprompters. We don't have planned exactly what we're going to say. We just kind of flow and have a conversation. And a lot of the stuff, as we've talked about before, that we get into isn't even planned necessarily in advance of the show.
So we might know what we're talking about and we might not.
That's
right.
Morgan
always knows what he's talking about.
Well, sometimes. I tell you, it's funny because what I'm learning is that you can think one thing and out of your mouth will come other things. Sometimes you don't even know it. You don't even know it. So our quick look back for last week, I was listening to the show at 5 p.m. after it aired live at noon to 1 and then it replayed at 5. And I was listening and I heard myself say the name Jonathan Richman as that Columbia Law School professor that James Comey leaked those memos that he wrote about his meetings with the president to. And of course, when I heard it at 5 p.m., I immediately was like, wait a minute. It's not Jonathan Richman. It's Daniel Richman. But the funny thing is, as I was saying it live, just Jonathan's what came out. I happen to know a Jonathan Richman. But anyway, it's just funny how things can get a little mixed up. So, folks, if you hear us say something that you don't think is right and you want to correct us, we're not perfect. And we'd love to have you be a part of the conversation. So anytime you hear something like that, feel free to give us a call at 888-404-1010. So keep us on a tight track.
You can say it however you want. However, if you say Notre Dame, they'll definitely know you're talking about France.
That's right.
And not Indiana.
Good
right?
call. Good call.
I did read a funny tweet, though everybody takes jabs at the president and we don't like it. But it was a tweet someone said, President Trump tweeted, why didn't the football players just put the fire out at Notre Dame?
Did he really?
No, he did not.
Okay, good.
He did
I was
not.
like, oh, man.
Yeah.
I have trouble defending that one if he did that. But okay. All right. Well, the thing about it is Notre Dame, what a beautiful structure. I've actually been there years ago and been around. Have y'all had did y'all get the chance to go there? Yeah, Rox, you did? Pat George?
No, I've never been over the pond.
Yeah. Well, it was, it was an interesting place. I have to say it wasn't what I thought was the greatest cathedral that I ever went into. It is just speaking plainly. I thought it was very dark in there, which, was part of the reason when they built those cathedrals with the big windows and everything was to let the light in because, it was kind of dark in some of those, old stone buildings.
Well, I thought was crazy is that the fuse box was still the same fuse box from the 1600s.
I don't think that's true, Pat George. Is that what they're saying in the news?
They were saying the wiring and some of the connectors that started it, or they were from the, and I thought, Did
They're
they
not
even
even
have that in
compatible with
1600s?
today's day and age.
I don't think that's true because I've seen an interview in French
Right.
with the actual guy who was in charge of fire safety there.
Right.
And he said that in the mid-90s they came and they redid all the
Yeah, you
wiring
would think.
in the entire – yeah, hello. Well, and my other thing is – I mean, look, first of all, if you remember, they came out right away and said it was not terrorism. One thing we're sure of, it was not an attack. Well, I don't even know. They didn't even put the fire out yet, and they're telling us what started it. Now, I can tell you, I mean, look, fires can start very easily. I'm a big believer in that. I mean, sometimes you could throw a cigarette over into, the grass, and that'll start a forest fire. You wouldn't think that could happen. You just wouldn't, you'd be surprised. So it's certainly possible that this fire began accidentally. At the same time, on the other side of things, it did happen right after construction work let off for the day.
Right after the guests left, too.
Yeah. So, I mean, it would be natural if somebody was on their way out the door and they wanted to start the fire on the way out, that would be the time to do it. Also, just sort of one of the things that sticks in my mind is this thing stood for 800 years. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So if it was that easy to start a fire there, it probably would have already happened by now and the thing would have burned down, but it stood for 800 years. And when the wood gets that old, a lot of people probably think, oh, it's old and dry, so it burns like tinder. No, it's actually close to petrified, actually. It's so old, so it's actually not going to burn that well. And that's what this guy was saying. Of course, he wasn't suggesting, and we're not suggesting, anything more than the fact that, it is a little strange that this occurred the way it occurred. Now, maybe it was an accident. We have to kind of wait and see. Last thing I wanted to kind of point out to you, a couple things actually. Back in 2016, there were some articles, and you may have forgotten about them because, the news cycle's so thick with information anymore, but it talked about actual ISIS sleeper cells throughout Europe. They called them crocodile cells for some reason, but these crocodile cells throughout Europe that were going to be attacking Europeans. And what's actually been going on, I mean, there was actually a failed attack. I don't know if you remember, we probably didn't hear about it, where 3 women, of all things, and these were not old women, they were 19, 23, and one was 39, so fairly young women, were arrested, and they had planned to essentially try to blow up Notre Dame and the train station nearby, and they found the car with gas cylinders in it, and actually somebody had tried to set them off using a cigarette, a discarded cigarette, and it did not catch. It didn't set them off. But apparently that was their plan back then, was to try and take out Notre Dame. Now, we also have got, if we skip forward, and this I find, sad, because just about, I don't know, what was it, about a couple of weeks ago, so this before the fire, a couple of weeks ago, an article came out, and it talked about what's going on in France right now. And it talks about recent incidents, including a fire in Saint-Sulpice Church in Paris, human excrement being smeared on the walls at Notre Dame des Enfants in Nimes, France, and vandalization of an organ at the Saint-Denis Basilica, which is outside Paris. You know that 2 churches every single day are vandalized in France right now? So there is a huge campaign, anti-Christian campaign going on in France. Now, is it being run by the recent Muslims who've all been brought into Europe? I don't know. Probably part of it is. There's also a huge anti-religious secularist movement throughout Europe. The only thing is I've never seen that particular movement go violent. That's the only thing. I've never seen that movement resort to violence because it's based on reason. They say, well, of course there's no God and we're anti-religion and all that. Okay, now I don't agree with them. I think they're off base on their reasoning. But nevertheless, we haven't ever seen them get violent to kill people who are religious. So that would tend to militate against them being heavily involved in this. But at this point, we don't know exactly what's happened. We're probably never going to know because the authorities came out right away and said, well, it's definitely not terrorism. It's definitely not arson. We don't know what caused it, but we do know that it's not arson. So I think that, we'll probably never get to the true story if it is really arson. I don't think they're going to reverse that. There's some reason, and maybe they don't want the public to go, ballistic and start, attacking Muslims. And so maybe they're thinking, well, we can justify covering up the actual cause of this in order to protect those people.
I mean, when you hear those descriptions of things, the defecating and the just vile acts and the violent
offensive
acts, right, then it just becomes like, it's just so uncivilized.
Right.
And like you said, the secular movement isn't about that. That's more about logic and making an argument.
Right. We don't tend to consider
argument.
them barbarians. But, others, I don't know. So we'll wait and see. We're going to wait for some more information on that. But if you're thinking about this, folks, just remember, ISIS tried to blow up Notre Dame once. They're trying to attack Europe, all throughout Europe. There's all kinds of ongoing attacks against churches in France that, including fires. I mean, there are deliberate fires being started in several of these other churches. So this is a tactic that's being applied by somebody. Is it the secularists? Is it the Muslims? At this point, we can't say. I suspect it's the Muslims, just based on what we've discussed, and based on the fact that we know that they are engaged in a civilization jihad with us. They talk about this. I mean, we're not putting any words into their mouth. They're engaged in conquest. They are here to take over the entire world and bring the entire world under Islam. There's no Christianity, no Judaism, no other choices. No, by the way, for those of you who are so enlightened, no secularism. Everybody goes under Islam. That's what they want, and that's what they believe that their God, has mandated for them to do. So we're not putting any words in their mouths when we talk about, civilization jihad, conquest, and things like that. These are their words. These are their concepts of what they're doing. So I think we have to take all of that into account as we analyze and evaluate what's going on. Well, we've got so much more to cover. We haven't even talked about the Mueller report. I wanted to get to something about the border as well. And then I don't think it would be right if we didn't at least mention a few things again about Julian Assange. And then, of course, we've got to get to our Out There Yet today. So we've got a lot left to cover, folks. Hope you're enjoying it. Stick around. We'll be right back on the Morgan Streetman Show.
Oh, we're having some juicy off-air discussions here. Okay, back to business.
These cannot go up on YouTube later.
What are you in there talking about how much gas the Democrats have now because they got a full tank of fuel because of the Mueller report?
Yeah,
my.
For sure.
Well, Pat, we talked about the Mueller report some last week, you and I did, because, you got on the horn with me, and right when it came out, we were running through it. And, here's the thing. There are two parts of it, right? There's the collusion part, the obstruction part, Volume 1, Volume 2. And the media now doesn't want to talk anything about Volume 1. Because Volume 1 was supposed to be the whole reason this all occurred, right? There was some kind of conspiracy or collusion. And for all these holier-than-thou types who are like, I don't understand the word collusion. I mean, it's in Rod Rosenstein's memo authorizing, the scope of the investigation. So, everybody's been using the word collusion, including the legal authorities themselves. And it's well understood. And we covered that here. It's well understood that that's essentially the same thing as conspiracy. So... But, one of the things that I wanted to bring up with this is the fact that, one, he doesn't find collusion, and he apparently knew that by the end of 2017. So think about the implications of that. Think about the implications. He knew by the end of the president's first year in office that there was no conspiracy between the president or any members of his campaign and Russia. And then he's let us sit here for the last year and a half and wait for that result. Supposedly while they investigate obstruction, which, look, I'm not a specialist in criminal law or anything, but I know a little bit about it, and I know enough to know that basically what the president was doing was not obstruction of justice. He would have had to do something that had an effect, number one, and he didn't. He did a lot of talking, apparently, talking to a lot of his aides, maybe even asking them to do stuff that they refused to do, etc. But, that stuff didn't happen. I mean, just talking about shutting something down isn't itself obstruction. And then we got to look at the extra piece, which is that it would only really be obstruction of justice if something was actually being covered up. If there really was Russian collusion or conspiracy that he didn't want to get out, and he was doing something to obstruct the truth from coming out, to obstruct justice. But the problem is, the truth was that there was no Russian collusion, no Russian conspiracy. This whole thing was made up from the get-go. And we've just sat through 2.5 years of it, and now we got these people coming out on TV, and it's just amazing to me how they're trying to spin Volume 2. I mean, it's like somebody got a hold of the National Enquirer and thinks that that's like court evidence. And they're like, yeah, but the National Enquirer said that, he hates children and small dogs. Well, okay, but, that's not evidence of anything.
I liked yesterday, I think it was Face the Nation, but one of the Democrats that were on there, and I don't remember the name, but I was listening in the background too, so for not to see the face, I don't remember, but said, this is just the beginning. Oh, this is just the beginning. Now we've got our hands on it. Now we can get started. Can you imagine that? 8 years from now.
I know. Well, that was their plan. And we've covered that here on this show, folks. We've clued you into the fact, if you want to go and look for this, you could still find it. This information is still out there. They were talking about impeachment well before they ever got onto this Russian conspiracy narrative. Well before they got onto that, they were talking about impeachment just generally as soon as President Trump got elected. Now, of course, the intelligence agencies were doing this Russia investigation thing, so they knew about it. But a lot of the politicians, by and large, were not informed about it, and a lot of the chattering class and the media, by and large, were not informed about it at that time, and they were still talking about impeaching him. He's unfit to be president. We've had some of those clips on the show before, and it's just kind of crazy because the point is they had a conclusion. They started at the conclusion, which is that President Trump is an evil, bad person and needs to be impeached, and they just work backwards to that conclusion. So now we just have to get whatever we can get a hold of that proves what we already know is true, what we've already concluded. And that's the way a lot of them are acting about this. I mean, I think it's shameful, frankly, to have a prosecutor who, the true decision for the prosecutor is charge or don't charge. And we don't have a system in this country where if the prosecutor doesn't charge you with a crime, they go ahead and publish everything they've collected in the meantime, which, by the way, a lot of it's hearsay, right? A lot of it's not actual direct evidence. It's either circumstantial evidence or it's hearsay or other things. They're investigating all that. They're collecting all that. And there's nothing improper about investigating that and collecting it because that's what you have to go through to get to real evidence frequently. But remember, they went through all that. They never found any real evidence. And so now they decide, we'll just publish all this kind of muckraking that we did on you and every bad thing that anybody said about you over the past 2 years and all this supposition. And that's what people are sinking their teeth into and what they're saying, this is just the beginning and stuff. But I don't think it is just the beginning. I think this investigation is essentially over with. Now, the Democrats in Congress may want to filibuster and spin their wheels and argue and hold hearings and things like that. But I think the leadership knows that, one, impeachment is not a realistic option. Two, it's certainly not realistic when there's no underlying crime. If all they're going to go on was the obstruction, you mean where President Trump fired James Comey because Rod Rosenstein told him to? And because everybody knew James Comey should have been fired because James Comey was running the FBI like it was his own personal fiefdom. He was letting his independent contractor friends have full access, unsupervised, to the FISA database, Foreign Intelligence Services Act database, with all the secret information going through your text messages, my emails, phone calls, and everything else. And maybe it wasn't me and maybe it wasn't you, but it was whoever they wanted to go through because nobody was tracking it. So they picked their political enemies and they muckraked on them. They gathered all that secret intelligence information that nobody else gets access to that violates the Fourth Amendment. You shouldn't be searching people without a warrant. You can't just go through people's papers. You can't just go into their home and open up their safe and look through it. But that's exactly what these independent contractors were doing on James Comey's watch. So James Comey is probably one of the worst directors of the FBI that we ever had in this country. I mean, he is an arch criminal for what he did. I'm serious, folks. If you don't think the Constitution is serious, if we cannot uphold the Bill of Rights and the right against unreasonable, unlawful search and seizure of your papers, of your effects, if we can't even count on that, then we don't have any law in this country. I don't care about all of the United States codes. I care about the big picture stuff. I care about freedom of speech. I care about freedom from government interference, freedom from government having a general warrant to go through your papers, which is what the British did. That's the reason we fought, to become free from that kind of tyranny. And now here we are again, and it seems like it's kind of taking over again because the state has grown too large. And another place where we see that playing out is in the arrest of Julian Assange. If you're interested in the Assange issue, what I would suggest, because there's so much there is so much there to unpack. And the smears and the slanders of Julian Assange just come one after the other. I mean, everything from he was somehow abusing his cat, right? Remember that one? Remember he's smearing poo on the walls at the Ecuadorian embassy? I mean, do you really think that was occurring? I mean, that is just slander. That's just slander. Oh, he didn't take a bath. More slander. You know, people that go to visit him, and he does. He has lawyers that visit him. Pam Anderson visits him pretty regularly. Frankly, probably for conjugal visits. We'll never know, I guess. But visits him pretty regularly to lift his spirits up. Yeah, she loves him and you know, but anyway, these people
and she's an animal rights activist, so something tells me if he was hurting that cat, Pam she would not be his friend.
The point is, Julian Assange was keeping himself reasonably clean, just like the rest of us. He wasn't refusing to bathe. And by the way, what's the implication of, you know, the idea of somebody smearing excrement on the walls? They've completely lost their minds. I mean, we call that, you know, batshit crazy, don't we? So, you know, so what are you saying, that finally this 7 years of you know, house arrest in the Ecuadorian embassy, essentially, that he's been under, has finally mentally broken him, and we think it's funny and we think it's a point to attack him on, that he's lost his mind? But again, I don't think any of that stuff has happened. So, you know, there's a lady out there, some of you may be familiar with her. Her name's Caitlin Johnstone. She's kind of an independent commentator, and she writes for Medium and posts on Twitter, and she's gotten very popular. She's definitely a leftist, but she's anti-war. And you know, and there are things that I agree with her about, a large number of things. There are a whole bunch of things that I don't agree with her about. But she's assimilated a list of like all the 30 smears that are currently being deployed by the media and media pundits everywhere against Julian Assange. And then she goes through and refutes them one by one. It's about a 35-page article that she wrote. But if you're really focused on the Assange stuff, I'd recommend you go out there and look at that. And one of the things that she kind of debunks, which I thought was interesting, was, you know, one of the things that I suggested maybe was going on this program, which is, you know, when we got President Trump saying he doesn't even know who WikiLeaks is, that doesn't have the ring of truth to it, considering that back during the campaign,
he referenced it.
He couldn't stop talking about WikiLeaks. He knew everything about WikiLeaks. So I don't believe the president's statement. Now, you know, one of the things we suspected is, could he be making that statement essentially to cover up what they're doing, which is bringing Julian Assange back, maybe to testify about who his source was for the leaks of the DNC and John Podesta emails. Now, Caitlin Johnstone says that Assange will never reveal his source because that's part of his journalistic ethics. I thought once the source had died that maybe that mandate went away. I don't know. I don't know enough about, you know, journalistic ethics to know if that's the case or not. But she made it sound like it was zero chance that he would ever reveal his source, even at this point. Even if it is Seth Rich and Seth Rich was killed, she thinks Julian Assange would never reveal it. The other thing that kind of makes me suspect of, you know, my rosy view of things, that maybe Assange is going to come back and we'll get to the truth here, is the fact that, you know, Mike Pompeo, our current Secretary of State, former director of the CIA, has called WikiLeaks a hostile non-state intelligence service, which I think is a false claim. And he said a lot of really negative things about Julian Assange. And it seems to me that Mike Pompeo has the president's ear right now. I think William Barr and Mike Pompeo are probably his two most trusted advisors right now. And I know both of them are very anti-Assange. They want to see Assange, quote unquote, brought to justice. And so it causes me to wonder if maybe Assange isn't being given up for, you know, like a horse trade. Okay, you know, you deal with the Mueller report, make it really clear that I didn't have anything to do with the Russians. And at this point, then, you know, do whatever you want with Julian Assange. And the only reason he was arrested, I mean, don't get confused. The only reason he was arrested was to extradite him back to the United States. And this also blows a hole in, by the way. Remember, we were talking about this last year, how they said he could leave anytime he wants. He was not under U.S. indictment. And we said, no, we found in a paper a reference to Assange being under a sealed indictment in the Eastern District of Virginia. So he actually can't leave that embassy anytime he wants. But you can go out there and find the commentators telling you that there's no reason for him to stay in there, that he's not going to be extradited to the U.S., that he hasn't been indicted, etc. And again, folks, I just want you to think about this. Remember, these folks have been wrong before. They're going to be wrong again. Maybe you shouldn't trust them. And the last thing I'll say is we'd like to see the truth win out. Truth over fiction, disclosure over secrecy. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. Morgan just told me something that's pretty unsettling.
They stole our views.
Does Pat know about this?
No, Pat doesn't know about it. I try not to mention it because I just discovered it myself a few days ago. But you remember how well we were doing on YouTube finally? I mean, it was like we were catching fire.
Oh, yeah, you touched on this a little bit.
Yeah.
Things are disappearing.
No, they disappeared. Did I touch on that last week?
With me, yeah, personally.
Okay, personally. Okay,
not
yes.
here.
Yeah, I screenshotted it all. So you can see, you could see we had more views logged. And then now we have less views. I mean, they literally took away pretty much all those views I was talking about. They took over I watched them, and they took, probably 500 views away from us, which on a channel that we were just cracking over 4,500. And we were finally starting to get a little momentum, and they kind of stamped on us. So, we'll see. Yeah, the thing is, at the end of the day, the truth has a power all its own. And, it's like a match in a dark room, lights up the whole room. So, hopefully we will continue to build an audience and we will continue to build momentum despite the best efforts of the social media controllers to keep you folks from hearing what we have to say, because we're trying to tell you the truth. We're trying to reveal what's really going on to you. And, of course, the powerful forces don't necessarily want you to know what's going on. They'd rather that you stayed in the dark. They'd rather keep you fat, drunk, and stupid, right?
Well, Breitbart is one publication that talks all the time about different ways that they're censored online. You can go to that site, but you would never, ever see a Breitbart story anywhere in a Google search.
That's right. Right. And you try posting one on Twitter. You'll get no response because they won't deliver it to anybody, or Facebook or whatever. And, that's what we found is going on. But we're going to keep plugging away. We've got a lot of exciting stuff to continue talking to you about. And we hope you're able to find us despite their best efforts to try and suppress the information. And the other thing I'll say is this isn't just against us. I mean, that's sort of one of the things that got me down off the ledge a little bit about this is I looked online, and a lot of people have had a lot of views taken from them. And you can find the videos. You could just type, views stolen by YouTube into the YouTube search bar, and you'll get, several dozen videos of people who are up in arms. And some of these people lost way more than even we did. Now, I don't know as a percentage, but some of them would lose like 20,000 views. So, and of course, it's their livelihood. This is not, luckily, how I make my living. So, the effect on me is somewhat limited. But anyway, that kind of brought me down off the ledge to know that, misery loves company, right? So to know that they're not just stealing my views, they're stealing a lot of people's views.
You're not the only one.
I'm not the only one. So, at least that makes me feel a little better
and
about it.
Some of your stuff is still there, so that's good.
That's right. They haven't taken it down yet. They haven't totally depublished my page yet. So, we wanted to pick back up with our Out There where we left off last week, and that is underwater civilizations. Now, one of the reasons we want to kind of talk to you about this is because it throws what we understand as the history of human civilization into question. In other words, maybe we don't know the full story. Maybe things didn't develop exactly like they taught us, back in elementary school or middle school or wherever they were teaching us how things came about in this world. Because as we shared with you last week, about 10 years ago, they discovered what appears to be an underwater city in about 2,000 feet of water off the western coast of Cuba. And the last time that the water level would have been that low, apparently, so that could have been a city above water, would have been 50,000 years ago. Now, the thing is, our accepted view of human civilization does not allow for human cities of that sophistication 50,000 years ago. I mean, 50,000 years ago, we should have been basically large pockets of distributed humans performing local agriculture. And that's it. No cities, no major infrastructure, no water treatment facilities or anything like that. But all that is newer technology. Say the last 5,000 or 6,000 years, a lot of that's come to be. But you go back 50,000 years and we shouldn't be this developed. So that's one thing. Now, they haven't gone back. You'd like to see them go back. I got to imagine it's pretty difficult to I don't even know if you could, I guess you could dive that. You'd probably use a submarine to go down to 650 meters. maybe you'd have to dive it in one of those diving suits or
Right.
something. I mean, I don't even know if you could go down that far in a diving suit, 2,000 feet. I've never even conceived of, I wouldn't go that far underwater, that's for sure.
No, thank you.
Yeah, I'd be scared to death. But this is not the only example of a city like this that's been found underwater. Wanted to bring you a couple of others that are out there in the world, and you can go and read up on these because, again, we have a limited amount of time here. I can't tell you all the details. I'm going to bring you the less exciting one first, I think, and that is the Yonaguni Monument. Have you heard of the Yonaguni Monument? That's off the southernmost coast of Japan, which Japan is actually a large archipelago of islands, and it actually stretches for quite a long way. So this particular location is only about 100 kilometers from Taiwan. Okay, so right off the coast, basically, of China. Taiwan, obviously, is not China, but it's right next to China. So right in that area at the Ryukyu Islands. And underwater, in I think it's about 100 feet of water, there is a structure called the Yonaguni Monument. Yonaguni, Yonaguni, Yonaguni. And you can go out there and look this up because the Japanese scientists that have investigated it have concluded that it does show signs of human intervention. Now, there are other people who've investigated it, including a guy who's kind of known for some out there type theories named Robert Schoch, who's a professor at Boston University. And he says everything you can see there is completely natural. So you can decide for yourself, folks. There's great videos out there that show you all the different structures, the different areas where it looks like there may be some more symbolic type of structures, faces and things like that. And you can look at it and you can check that out and make your own mind up on Yonaguni. There's another one, though, that is not subject to question, and that is Dwarka. Now, this city was an ancient city, and it was thought not to even exist. There is a modern city of Dwarka in India. This is in the western part of India. And that modern city was supposed to be the successor city to another city that they thought was legendary, and that is the legendary city of Dwarka. Well, guess what? They dived in the Gulf right outside the actual city of Dwarka in about 130 feet of water. And what did they find? But they found the ancient city of Dwarka in 130 feet of water. Now, they think maybe the last time that was above water was something between maybe as much as 7,500 to 10,000 years ago, or maybe as recent as 1,500 to 3,000 years ago, depending on, what happened there. Because the actual legendary story of this city is that this Indian, I'm going to put quotes around there, God, Krishna, I don't know if he technically counts as a god, it's polytheistic stuff. But anyway, he worshipped the Lord of the Sea, and the Lord of the Sea actually gave him 300 square miles out of the ocean to build a city on, the city of Dwarka. And later, the Lord of the Sea reclaimed that and covered over that. So that city is the earliest it could be is 1500 BC. Again, highly, highly civilized, very, very huge structures, monuments, things like that, things that should not have existed necessarily in that time, in that place. So there's some really interesting things out there that call into question a lot of the history that we've been taught. Folks, I'm Morgan Streetman, and that's the way I see it.
Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.